Thank you. You guys always receive me incredibly. The audio sounds tremendous, man. My engineer be playing that shit back, man. I just be elated, man. Shout out to the dribble. Shout out to everybody tuning in from all across the fucking world. Been looking at my analytics. Every platform that the dribble is available on: Deezer, Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon, just every platform is on, man. I'm getting a great response. So I'm starting to gravitate towards this form of media. It has less restraints as far as censorship and shit like that. I can kind of let my nuts hang. And that's why I chose to go ahead and share this report I have in my hand with you guys. If you follow my platform, the last, 5-6 years, I've had an incredible run in Washington, D.C. Shout out to D.C. Shout out to Sean Branch, Kurt Bone, Kareem Mowat, Pop Legendary, Victor Page, Mike Gill, Dave Mays from Source Magazine. He's from D.C. I hope I didn't forget anybody. D.C. has been incredible to me. I love D.C.'s history. It's a very, very unique black city, lots of talented people, basketball players, artists, musicians, all types of great people come out of DC. Marvin Gaye, lots of talented people. DC, of course, is also known for being the nation's most violent city in the late 1980s. And this report that I'm holding in my hand is something that's been on my desk for probably 9 months. At Gully TV, I come across all types of media documents, reports, case files, just tons of literature in relation to crime and shit like that. This document I have in my hand was something I can't even tell you where this came from. I can't remember. I've had it this long, but this is the second very, very powerful piece of I don't know if I should call it literature. It's nothing but chaos contained within the pages of this I'll call it the dossier. This is the second email I received, probably anonymously, during the course of covering Washington, D.C. The first was a packet I received from one of Wayne Perry's victims' families. A guy had been watching my show, and he sent me this packet. It was Wayne Perry's whole case. I was one of the first people online to have it. My original Instagram page, I shared it with a lot of people. But anyway, that Wayne Perry report was one of the first top secret documents I received as Gully TV. The second one, this one right here, I believe came from the police. It was a guy, I assumed him to be white, used to email me all the time, and he always wanted to talk about these old cases. And some of the information that he had, he just almost knew too much. I'm like, this dude got to be associated with law enforcement or some shit like that. And he was like, seemed like he was fascinated with the whole Washington, D.C. culture, especially the underground. But anyway, I got this Super Predator package that sat on my desk for like a year. I didn't know what to really do with this shit. YouTube might not have been the proper platform for it, but this Super Predator packet I have contains the names of what would be considered all of the top hitters of the time in Washington, D.C. You got Kevin Gray, Sam Carson, of course, Wayne Perry, Tommy Edelin, William Sweeney, Oscar Veal, Larry Gooch, and Thomas Fields. And then they got more Super Predator targets who aren't depicted. Dwayne Williams, Kenneth Ray Bryant, Sean Branch, my man, Marky Hoyle. I've heard a lot about Marky Hoyle. Tony Hammond, Kevin Honesty, Kobe Mowat. Shout out to First and Kennedy and Antoine White. These guys are evident. This list right here is evident that Wayne Perry wasn't the only one tearing up Washington, D.C. at the time. Washington, D.C. seems to have developed a reputation where Wayne Perry is known as the chief head buster in the city. There's guys on this list and contained within this packet who created way more havoc than Wayne. I ended up looking further into a couple of these guys' history. Oscar Ville and Tommy Edelin. A lot of these dudes, who end up being glorified, they was like low lives, pieces of shit, killed kids, killed teenagers, just killing everything and shit. This packet says, this is from the Safe Streets Task Force, by the way. I spoke of the Safe Streets Task Force before on my platform. The Safe Streets Task Force was created in Washington, D.C. to combat all of the neighborhood crews. Washington, D.C. is a place that never was infiltrated by like Crips, Bloods, Vice Lords, Gangster Disciples, things of that nature. The Safe Streets Task Force says, by targeting and removing these super predators, killers suspected of 10 or more homicides. Everybody on this list is suspected of 10 or more bodies. Safe Streets Task Force made substantial progress in reducing the number of killings in Washington, D.C. by removing the guys that I just named. I'm going to go ahead and read off into the report now. Organized crime in the nation's capital is concentrated in the hands of these violent street crews. At this time, there is no indication that well-established national and international crime organizations like the Mafia, organized crime, or outlaw motorcycle gangs have ever made any significant headway to control crime in the D.C. area. Nationally known street gang affiliates, Bloods, Crips, Black Gangster Disciples, and MS-13 have also not been able to establish any real base of control in Washington, D.C. Even the large Latin gangs like MS-13, 18th Street, and Vados Locos, who are present in the D.C. suburbs, continue to be ineffective in establishing any kind of criminal enterprise which control or expects to control the lucrative drug market. There are indications that these Latin gangs have been successful in the prostitution and gambling business, but even those activities don't provide financial resources to allow these gangs to claim metropolitan area and wide dominance of any criminal enterprises. In a nutshell, with this report saying the criminal underworld is controlled by black men in Washington, D.C. They've never relinquished. It's a place, you just heard it. Even the Mafia wasn't able to establish anything in Washington, D.C. An all-black city, they just wasn't having it. History has shown us that they wasn't having it. You've seen what they went through with the shower posse, and even the guys from New York. A lot of guys from New York got killed in D.C. coming down there to hustle. Alpo is somebody who's always spoken of in terms of Washington, D.C., but there's so many guys who didn't make it back to New York City coming down there to hustle and shit. What has become apparent to the law enforcement community is significant international wholesale drug operations like the Sinaloa and Gulf cartels, the Mexican Mafia, and some African heroin suppliers provide large quantities of the cocaine, heroin, and marijuana to the street gangs in D.C. who reap the lion's share of the profits and continue to control the bulk of the distribution of illegal drugs. PCP, another popular street drug in D.C., known in D.C. as Love Boat, is not manufactured in the D.C. area, so it is also provided by New York City and Los Angeles African-American mobsters who may have ties to some of the street gangs in those areas. But again, D.C. street crews maintain control of their operations and keep the out-of-towners at arm's length. Based on history, Alpo was one of the only people who came to D.C. and kind of like infiltrated, but it was an assassination attempt on his life where he was shot. Even he had the rough way coming down into the nation's capital. Some of the local wholesalers of drugs who are African American, white, or Hispanic also make a significant living selling wholesale weight of drugs, but again, their prime markets are the open-air drug markets throughout the city, which are controlled and dominated again by the street crews. If you're keeping up with any of the media in regards to Washington, D.C. on the internet, one of the more popular street crews is known as the First and Kennedy crew. I've encountered Kareem Mowat. I've developed a relationship with him. He's also in my book. And I asked him about a lot of the information contained in this report. And Kareem co-signed a lot of the information contained within this report. In September of 1974, John Willie Bryant, the mastermind of a robbery ring and notorious pimp, shot and killed the first female Washington, D.C. police officer to die in the line of duty. Officer Gail Cobb was killed while she attempted to arrest Bryant in a downtown parking garage. But because of his notoriety, Bryant became a leader of the Bureau of prison gang, known as the D.C. Gang. This prison gang was and still is one of the most violent prison gangs in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Bryant served much of his time in Leavenworth Prison Penitentiary, one of the most notorious federal prisons in the system. The prison gang was probably the first known violent gang associated with the District of Columbia. As I stated, John Willie Bryant was the mastermind of a notorious robbery ring in Washington, D.C. Prior to the drug game, armed robbery was the chief means of hustle in Washington, D.C. That's why a lot of these guys were easily able to convert over to notorious gunmen, kidnappers, etc. Beginning in the late 1970s, juvenile criminals on their way to becoming career adult offenders began their crime education at Oak Hill and Cedar Knoll juvenile correctional facilities, otherwise known as trade schools. These juvenile offenders brought with them street contacts from neighborhoods all over Washington, D.C. They associated with close friends and neighbors from their individual parts of the city. They learned the tricks of the trade and developed rules or guidelines for their criminal conduct and carried these codes of conduct back to the streets when they were released. Their relationship developed into full-blown criminal affiliations as they progressed through the city's criminal justice system and went on to serving time in Occoquan and Lorton adult prison facilities. In all of these facilities, minor disagreements and arguments set D.C. neighborhoods at odds, and in some rare cases, alliances were formed by the juveniles and youthful offenders. Neighborhood associations began to supplant but not fully replace primary relationships in the minds of these young criminals, and crews began to form that represented the beginnings of outright gang affiliations. Two notable groups came to the forefront in the early 1980s, the 8th and the H crew from Northeast Washington, D.C., which became well known as the first D.C. gang to be prosecuted for the vicious killing of Catherine Fuller in 1984. Miss Fuller was waiting for a bus at the corner of 8th and H Streets Northeast when she was robbed, beaten, raped, and murdered by members of this notorious street crew. Lesser-known gangs, the Gangster Chronicles and the A-Team, conducted business in the northeast section of Washington, D.C. during the late 1970s and early 80s. They were primarily involved in low-level marijuana sales and significant smash and grab robberies of jewelry stores and gun stores. Both gangs took their names from popular DC TV shows of the time, and thus began the close relationship between the Washington DC gang culture and the popular media. Gangster rap and DC go-go music became the underlying soundtrack for these neighborhood-based street crews. As the neighborhood crews began to grow in financial resources, violent confrontations developed with old animosities between neighborhoods, fueling feuds over territory and failed business deals. During this time, a new fascination with the sale and distribution of PCP-laced marijuana, angel dust, led to the development of street-level dealing as the enterprise of choice for the crews. New gangs like the R Street Crew, the P Street Crew, and the Waller Place Crew emerged as new drug enterprises operated by young entrepreneurs who sought to control the open-air drug markets throughout the city. Locations like Lincoln and R Street, Northeast, Sursum, Court of Courts, Condon Terrace, Lincoln Heights, Simple City, Paradise Manor, Delaware and North Southwest, Newton Street, Northwest were sought-after territories to control. A charismatic young drug dealer named Rayful Edmond III emerged as a hybrid between the old D.C. family-style career criminal drug dealer and the new young entrepreneur who sought to oversee the whole enterprise of drug dealing, from important large-scale amounts to maintaining and controlling an active street-level retail operation in and around his neighborhood, territories like Orleans Place, Northeast. Edmonds emerged simultaneously with the emergence of crack cocaine as the street drug of choice for Washington, D.C. residents. Edmonds' flamboyant style and rock-solid source of supply also sold wholesale amounts of cocaine to the leadership of some of the new neighborhood crews. Until that time, old-style drug dealers like Cornell Jones sold powder cocaine to users who snorted or freebased the drug, causing a somewhat lesser dependence on the drug. Crack, on the other hand, was highly addictive and, more importantly, was easier than heroin to break down into appropriate retail dosage units for easy consumption. Crack increased profits for Edmonds and his generation of drug dealers, but with the increased profits came more and more dependent on the use of violence to further support and protect the drug enterprise. Since these drug dealers were younger offenders, they tended to be more volatile and prone to overreact when they were slighted or disrespected. These same dealers had learned important lessons from their years of incarceration in Oak Hill and Lorton. The number one rule was not to snitch. This culture of mob or gang omerta was used as an almost biblical admonition to members of the emerging drug crews. Violence and death were the punishment. The crews, on the other hand, promised support for loyal members who kept quiet if arrested. Since the development of these drug dealing street crews in Washington, D.C., almost all of the sales of crack, heroin, and PCP are controlled by the crews. Money and violence go hand in hand to continue the drug enterprise and violence in weary neighborhoods. As a result of significant law enforcement operations like the D.C. Safe Streets initiative targeting most violent drug gangs and most violent predators, much of the tide of the violence has staunched. D.C. now enjoys a low annual homicide rate, but the prevalence of violent street crews continues to be the most significant source of drug-related violence in Washington, D.C. Washington and the close-in suburbs have low-cost housing where the drug dealing and violence continues to be the most significant crime problem in D.C. neighborhoods. Most of the violent offenders prosecuted for their involvement in street gang activity have been served their federal time in correctional facilities throughout the United States. As such, there continues to be a free flow of violent gang members who populate the D.C. gang. Membership in this gang is not limited to D.C. inmates, but the D.C. inmates continue to be the most important population source for the membership and especially the leadership positions of the gang. The D.C. prison gang also continues to be the source for standard of behavior within the criminal enterprises who currently operate in Washington, D.C. The Federal Bureau of Prisons Intelligence Network has reported an alignment of the D.C. gang with Chicago's black gangster disciples and some of the Islamic terrorists incarcerated in the Bureau of Prisons. Many of the crews targeted by the Safe Streets Task Force are listed within this report. The R Street Crew, the P Street Crew, the First Street Crew, the Montana Terrace Crew, the Newton Street Crew, the Benning Road Crew, the Wayne Perry Crew, the Paradise Manor Crew, the Tony Hammond Crew, the Langston Carver Crew, the Kentucky Courts Crew, the First and Kennedy Crew, the Fern Street Crew, the Condon Terrace Glass Manor Mob, the Stanton Terrace Crew, the Southwest Crew, Harold Cunningham Crew, that was a robbery gang, the Kevin Gray Crew, the 1-5 Mob, the 18th and M Crew, the 18th and D Crew, Congress Park Crew, 4th Street Mob, and the Young Guns from 22nd Street. I'll continue the rest of this report in part 2. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Make sure y'all subscribe to the channel. The next time I approach y'all with this report, I'm going to have all of the intricate details, and we're going to break down profiles on some of the super predators listed. Peace.